It's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Cook to you. He's a significant figure in the architectural engineering world, and there's an enormously long list of significant architectural projects that he's worked on and made possible and helped to bring to reality. He's been a profound influence and collaborator and friend to MTech for the 22 years that we've been going. We've done constructions that he's helped us with. He's given workshops both in studio and within Buro Happold premises, given lectures, given material and financial support over a very long period. He's also been very influential on the technical culture of the AA. And he's has been external examiner for intermediate and diploma for 5 years. He knows the AA and is a great friend of the AA, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. And it's great to be here, and it's been a joy to be involved with the AA for quite a long time. Certainly ever since I started working from London, and our office is, I don't know, just 300 yards, 300 meters away from each other. So it's really easy to come and I feel very much part of it. And I've really enjoyed being an external examiner recently. So I was delighted you invited me to speak. I wasn't quite sure who I'm going to be speaking to, but it gave me a chance over Christmas to worry about what I was going to say. So thanks for making it a worrying Christmas, but it's nice to have something else to worry about other than everything that's also being thrown at us. So, and it's given me a chance to sort of try and sort some of my ideas out, and that's a bit of a luxury to be asked to do that. So nice to be here. I'm going to speak, I haven't actually rehearsed this, so I tend to prefer just to see what comes out of my head, stimulated by the slide set that I've put together. But I know where I want to get to, and I'm hoping that it'll take about 40 minutes or so, and then to have a bit of time for any questions people want to ask. So you've seen my face. I'm not sure if you're about to lose my face, but I'm going to share the screen and start my slideshow. And that'll give me a chance to introduce me a bit. I'll just check. I suppose you're seeing this little thing here, are you? So I better get rid of that. Okay, so let's try to stay in control. Are you seeing that okay, Elif?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Okay, and I don't know if I can get rid of that little thing. Yes. So, Mike Cook, this is just a slide. I've used this one before elsewhere. Some of the projects I've been working on over the last few years, you might see a kind of a theme in there. There are various themes in there. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But my career has been spent mostly in Buro Happold. That's interesting. I'm writing on my screen now. But I also spend a lot of time teaching at Imperial College, and I teach creative design. And I have found, as I've grown up as an engineer, it's felt increasingly important for me to try and get in touch with engineering education, because I teach creative design, and I feel engineers need to be given the breadth and the capability, really, to innovate and to join in a creative process, effectively a co-creative process with others. And that the education system that we have doesn't always give space for that. So I'm very keen on that. And I do a lot of work with the Institution of Structural Engineers, other things as well, obviously, but I've put in the center here, construction declares climate and biodiversity emergency, because that's become a key part of what I have focused on now. And although I'm no longer so involved as a partner at Buro Happold, I still have a connection. And this just introduces me as a whole. Now, while I was thinking about what to say to this group of people, and I didn't really know what the title was, so I actually changed the title from what you might have seen published. But I think the theme that comes out of my career and comes out of what I think matters to us in the future is summed up in this nice stable pyramid. And I'm going to talk to you in these sort of chapters about having an agenda, having a purpose, with in my case, my career, having an agenda for a project, a purpose to the project, and knowing through that who to build your alliances with, who do you want to work with, who should you be working with, collaborating, even who should your clients be. So there's an agenda which sits on the outside of the pyramid, and building alliances in the center, in the core. And the same happens on from that, building alliances. It's about the methods of collaboration. How do we find ways of working together which can be truly called collaboration, leading ultimately to what I prefer to call co-creation. So I put that in the middle, and collaboration on the outside. That seems to be very important, and I'll step through that in a moment. And then finally, it seemed to be my career moved towards needing to find, always as an engineer perhaps, finding evidence for why one would do something. And out of that understanding, building an empathy with who you're doing it for and who you're doing it with. So that evidence building towards empathy. So I ended up with this triangle with these three core themes in the middle: alliances, co-creation, and empathy. I'm hoping that as I speak, that the whole kind of structure of the talk will build itself around that. And then casting back, and I only did this title on the slide about 2 hours ago, I realized I'm really kind of talking about who, building the alliances, how through collaboration and co-creation, and why. Why? Well, you need evidence to know why, and you need empathy with people to understand why. So those are the three: who, how, and why. And ultimately, I think what we need to do, because I think we have a disequilibrium at the moment, climate emergency tells me that. You can debate for hours where the disequilibrium is, but I call it building back some sort of equilibrium. So I end up thinking about how can we build back equilibrium where I think we've lost it. And I hope this all makes sense. And that diagram will come back once or twice as we go through that. So talking about agenda and alliances, I just wanted to share with you a bit of a career trajectory, and I'll hopefully not take too long on this. But looking back, and I've got the joy of being able to look back over quite a long career, and I called this the seduction, which is quite interesting. It's this sort of being drawn in to where I ended up. I wasn't sure I wanted to go there, but I got drawn in to becoming effectively a structural engineer. There were many things out there when I was 17 or 18 seducing me, as you can imagine, but one of them was the Sydney Opera House, it turns out. And there, of course, there was this fascinating relationship that I could even read about then between Utzon and Arup, and the relationships that succeeded and failed and succeeded, and led to what I then, as an 18-year-old, found as one of the most exciting things I'd ever seen. And it got me into Cambridge because in my interview, they asked me what building did I truly was most excited about, and I started talking to them energetically about the Sydney Opera House, and I seemed to know a lot more about it than they did. So that early recognition, this architect-engineer relationship, this delivering beauty but bringing technical capability into it. And at about that time, just before going to university, I found myself, I managed to get a part-time job, a short-term job at Arup in Soho Square. This little white building in the northwest corner is still there. And Ted had this really good relationship with Fry Otto, and I started working with Ted and Fry Otto, and I still feel this was a seduction into being a structural engineer, because I started to see this fascinating relationship between the kind of architectural perspective on life and the engineering perspective on life. And this diagram, if you dwelt on it, summarizes it quite well. It's just a sort of bias towards your way of thinking, but it doesn't mean you've completely annihilated the other. But these symbiotic relationships between individuals seem to be right at the start of my career. And not only that, so I was starting to build these kinds of alliances with really fascinating people. And with Fry especially, there was this sense of building from nature, ideas from nature, which allowed us to create something which was man-made. And seeing this real collaboration around model making and trying to understand very complex geometries and ideas, working very closely together, architects and engineers all fiddling with the same model to try and get to grips with things. And so the first project I was working on was the Mannheim timber grid shell, still there. Nobody quite knows what to do with it, but I hope they will soon. But it's from a temporary structure, it soon became a kind of permanent icon. And this was an upside down hanging chain model to find the geometry of such a complex concept. But this was completely new to me at 18, and seeing buildings that didn't look like buildings, but were inspired by nature, kind of started to drive my agenda for pretty much the rest of my career. Of course, you have to reference Gaudi at some point doing this. Not that I had to find out about him a bit later. And I was busy hanging nails on models of this thing just to find out when it was going to buckle. And that was really exciting and fun because I could feel the forces. I also had to write computer data to go into it, and that wasn't very exciting. And I never did get my computer run to run because computers were big, ugly things in those days and not very user-friendly. So I didn't get very seduced by that. But out of this early 18, when I was 18, I started to find people I wanted to align with and built an agenda around natural forms and efficient forms. And that drew me away from London to Bath, where Ted had set up a practice called Buro Happold, and the university, working, in fact, up at the university on models for air support structures. You can see the wonderful low-tech research that I was doing, nothing like what you could do now. But that set me off on a trajectory with FREng, with Ted Happold and his various partners that had set up Buro Happold, looking at natural forms and how we might build them. So on the right-hand side, building models of these rather interesting and beautiful, naturally inspired forms. And that took me in the very early part of my career to kind of seduce me fully into this idea of beautiful buildings, co-created between architecture and engineering, buildings which really didn't know whether they were architecture or engineering because they were both at the same time. And going right through to this 58 North project for Alberta, a large roof, inflated roof over a whole community, where you had to bring in psychologists, sociologists to really understand the impact that putting a whole community under one big roof might affect. So I realized out of this was coming a kind of instinct for collaboration and the using of the central model as part of that collaboration. And with good collaboration tools like physical models, being able to co-create so that you could sit around a table, model in the middle, and whether you were an architect, a building services engineer, a structural engineer, or a client, you could kind of communicate to each other. And out of that communication, you could co-create your answers. Now that was my start, but I couldn't spend all my time doing lightweight structures. So when I did more straightforward structures like this at Bedfont Lakes IBM marketing headquarters, I found myself lucky enough to also work with collaborators who were really interested in this coming together of engineering, architecture, materials technology, and effectively natural forms. And so working with Patty Hopkins at Bedfont Lakes, I was even there able to bring in things like tree-like columns, which got bigger towards the base and celebrated the connections with the exposed beams, shading, which was just lightweight, canopy over the atrium, and so on. It's a stretch, but working with architects there who were really interested in what the engineering wanted to say, what the physical solutions really wanted to be, and how best to use materials, allowed me to carry on what I'd learned in Bath into mainstream architecture, if you like. This is mainstream in terms of building between two existing Edwardian buildings. You know this Imagination headquarters next to the building centre in London. and great fun working with Ron Heron and John Randall on a membrane structure. So bringing a kind of FREng lightweight structure into a mainstream building. And of course, this is just off Bedford Square, so you can actually see it if you look in the right direction from the front door of the AA. And so I found that set of alliances and that agenda that I caused, developed, carried through. So as I built new relationships, it kind of naturally came in the relationship. So when I first started working with Foster and Partners, when the opportunities arose, and they did here very early on with the British Museum, you could take what could have been quite a straight solution, and with encouragement and this kind of co-creation, we were able to create this very natural form, which arose in the roof form, with a bit of help from Bath University and Chris Williams to get this right, because this was computer generated. You could see the natural forms starting to creep into all these projects that I was doing, and that relationship with Foster and Partners became really central to my learning and my producing through that middle part of my career. And here's the Gateshead Sage, and here's some really early models that I was playing with, trying to bring some Mannheim thinking into a concert hall roof. And then it goes on, so that there was those early days and those alliances that I made started to find a way of collaborating where architect wanted to know what the engineer thought, and the engineer wanted to join in and collaborate and co-create. So this co-creation allowed us to come up with a lot of different unusual ways of doing things. Here at Dresden railway station, pulling the roof off and saving all of that steelwork that was about to be condemned by putting a much lighter weight stressed membrane roof over the top. And here in Astana, with a giant roof over a leisure center in Kazakhstan. And what I think I was learning, and this is where I'm trying to take us to on this journey, is this need to co-create, not just with our own collaborators like architects, quantity surveyors, and so on, but with the client. And even at this stage, working with models and working also with other methods like sketching. Now, I found, I only really realized it when I looked back, that it was really essential for me to be able to talk to these people in a very immediate way, at a meeting, in a meeting, to make the decisions and to get people joining in. And it turned out that just that simple sketch, for me, became a really important tool in how we communicated, and got everyone to join in the same process, the shared sketching, the shared doodle, as we start to test ideas with each other and co-develop solutions to those. So I threw a few of those doodles. I got a few of my old notebooks that I hadn't thrown away against some of the projects, and I just want to emphasize how central this has been to my developing my way of working, I suppose, my collaboration and my co-creation. And here's the Khan Shatir again, and these doodles, which need to happen right in the immediacy of a working meeting, so that everybody can take part, add their pieces, throw it in the bin, start again. And that's a process which I'm sure can be reproduced remotely from each other digitally, but you have to make space for that to happen. You have to want it to happen, I think, to get to that level of co-creation. And I've now found that it's not just when you're designing buildings. I find almost every single problem, every single meeting I go to where we're trying to collaborate and co-create a solution, it helps if I can't really help myself, but to draw up diagrams which summarize the thinking in the room. It's not my thinking always, thinking in the room, say, I think this is what we're saying, and then we can start remodeling. So that collaboration, co-creation is also an important feature, and it belongs in that triangle. And then finally, I realized the next step in my career was, as computational engineering started to really take off, I'm not a programmer, but I enjoy the ability to amass so many layers of evidence behind how things are working, to really understand more deeply a level of evidence that you can't get in physical models alone, and you can't represent in sketches alone. And this is a really important other tool as far as I'm concerned. So I started to realize, computational energy to help us understand environments, to help us control what we produce, were really important. And then it became even more exciting when I realized that we could start to look at how people work in buildings, walk around buildings, experience buildings, and how that might change their emotional state even. And so that became a really important focus. And I see that as just a smooth trajectory, really, but into bringing evidence into design, but then evidencing how people will experience the design became really exciting to me as well. And that's something that we've been developing in the practice over the last 10 or 15 years. And using those as tools, I put this up working at the Barbican, for instance, really quite recently, tools which clients can sit around the table with you and for the first time understand some building in action, as complicated as the Barbican Centre, as we all know. It's pretty complicated, and to help illuminate the problems and co-create the answers seemed really, really exciting, and I think is important. And then to translate that into emotional human aspects of how people are responding and how you can help your designs make buildings that are better for people became central. So that's a sort of progression. And when I look back, that in a way, that's all we were doing, when I was, almost in my short trousers working with someone like FREng. He'd been exploring a new kind of architecture, which brought much more humanity back into it. As a reaction, I understand, to the period of history in Germany that he'd been through. He wanted to react against that because of the inhumanity and bring nature and humanity back into architecture. I don't think I realized it. Perhaps that permeated into me quite strongly. So now I can see, by using all the tools and using them for co-creative purposes with the right agenda, we can do amazing things. And these are two projects of Buro Happold's that I personally have no responsibility for at all, but they're the two that I admire the most. And I always make a point when I'm in Riyadh to visit the one on the right, or in New York to visit the one on the left, High Line, obviously. I always make a visit there, and it always gives tingles up my spine when I go there to both of these projects, because it's bringing a kind of restored nature back into the city. It's creating a place in the city that so many people flock to and just have their spirits lifted. And we need these places in our cities. And so I'm always so pleased to have these examples to visit. And somehow this needs to be the sort of theme that we introduce into our projects where we possibly can. So I've got to this point now. I think it's time to look forward, I guess, from here. And we're talking here about allies, about co-creation, and about having an empathy through a better understanding. That all comes together into some kind of continuum. And this idea that perhaps we've got a continuum, but somewhere between, we have designers and pure designers, we have users and pure users, but there's a big space in here, using all of the tools and the will that we might bring to it, to have a kind of co-creative space where we share each other's jumpers, if you take this literally, and we're all invested in the solutions. And in a funny nostalgic way, it sort of takes us back to how it used to be, with this kind of equilibrium where people helped each other, co-created, used the materials that were natural and the resources they had, and had a kind of empathy with their environment. It all makes a kind of sense now. Can we bring that back in? Because I think in projects like this, there is a kind of empathy for people and an empathy for the natural world that gets brought in. So back to that diagram, kind of the destination, I think, is what I'd call, refinding, if you like, this equilibrium. Through the right people working together through the right processes that allow and respect co-creation, and then having that kind of empathy with each other and with the people that will be impacted by what we're talking about and developing, and with nature, having empathy with the natural world as well. And that kind of defines answers to the who, the how, and the why. And of course, this equilibrium breakdown, we all know about. I barely need to say what the symbols are, but they mean that over the last 250 years in particular, we've accelerated this disequilibrium between mankind and the natural world. And we're this has gone also in terms of the humanity of how we do things and how we use humans as sort of units of resource. And we bring out all the resources of the planet and create unbelievable harm. So in this kind of emergency situation, people are really becoming sensitive to what are the solutions? How do we develop in a much more empathetic way with nature and the natural world? And we've seen as this has accelerated and spread across the world, these massive temperature rises, the contributors to this problem. It's very, there's a long debate about how you measure that contribution, but generally speaking, those who've contributed to the problem have prospered, and those who've made very little contribution to the harm that's been done are failing to prosper. So there's a real inequality about where we've ended up. And we need to find ways of reversing that harm, and that's not simple. But of course, many of you will be well aware of Kate Raworth and donut economics, and I think the symbol is a really important one for me to help us understand that we cannot go beyond a certain ecological ceiling, ecological line, after which we really start to degrade ecology and degrade the environment and harm the planet. But we do have to develop in ways which will create social foundations and equity around the world with that. And I always think when I look at the donut, I think there's another dimension which is quite interesting. I'm not sure I've completely resolved this, but if you look at the donut as a three-dimensional torus, you start to be able to talk about stable and unstable equilibrium. And I've always, ever since doing it in physics, I've been fascinated by the idea that you can have unstable equilibrium. But if we have any kind of equilibrium, it is certainly now unstable. And this was the diagram they always taught us for unstable equilibrium. Any tiny little jolt, and any tiny little jolt, and your slides have a mind of their own. And you slip off. And I feel that that's really where we are. We're slipping fast off the edge. The only thing is we may well be slipping off both edges at the same time. Haven't worked that one out. But of course, there needs to be things we can do to change. We need, as I see it, and I summarized it this way, there's a series of stimuli around us that kind of create the urgency and the impetus for change. And then there's a series of means of change that are creeping in that we're starting to see, which add up to a sufficient substance that I can have some level of optimism that we are changing enough things to be able to move from the red trajectory in this diagram to the green trajectory. And I just want to run through those very briefly. So in terms of the stimuli, I may not need to highlight them to you, but we're seeing health issues through pollution, through what we've been doing with nature, arguably, pandemic situations. We're seeing massive harm and danger being created around the world, fires, floods, and so on.
Sir, you're muted.
We've lost your sound, Mike.
Yeah, I just saw that a thing came up on my screen. You should hear me now. I don't know why it did it, just automatic.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. People speaking out. It's strange, people speaking out and I get muted. And we're seeing more and more of that, and I think we will see more and more of that. So there is real stimulus for change and real reasons for change that I think these need to be more and more visible to us, so that we can right. It's interesting. Here we go. Just had a little IT breakdown for a moment there. So what are the kind of drivers? There's definitely things around us that we can use as available drivers to us. And one of these, I don't know about the images, but the technology that's available to us improves the way we do things, improves the way we communicate, improves the way we think, potentially in AI. I don't think, I'm not a great believer in technologies as a total solution, but as a piece of the solution. Better use of our materials, better ways of communicating, better ways of thinking even are potentially part of it. Part of it also is I've still put this under technical, but a different way of thinking about development, where we prioritize the positive impacts on people and on nature, and move away from the negative impacts. And I always find, what Living Building Challenge tells us as a really good checklist for being able to create a regenerative development, which causes healing and takes in more CO2 than it puts out, and more than that, heals the environment. Also, social change. I think there's a lot of the connectivity that we're now seeing, and of course, appropriately in this lecture, that ability to connect people up across the world, the power that is creating, I think, and the connectedness that it creates can't be underestimated. I think we haven't seen, we're just starting to experience what that can mean. There are new models of education. There's a lot of moves afoot, not just in the UK, but beyond, about bringing in a different way of teaching people about the world, which means they bring in to, for instance, engineering, a much clearer view of the planetary responsibilities, the human responsibilities. The customers, with this interest and connectivity of people, people will want to buy different things. I mean, even now, people want to eat different things. They want to exercise differently. They will not want to live in carbon guzzling, embodied carbon buildings, etc. So I'm a positive thinker about the change of customer habits will be very powerful, and we're already seeing as it says on the headlines, real estate giants unite, and they're starting to think in terms of what they develop so that it has a long-term future. They're looking here about the risks of developing the wrong thing, and considering different stages of how the climate might be in the future, and how we develop to that, and how we can improve the conditions we're developing to. So new business models are coming in, and new priorities coming in, and cities starting to declare and think differently about the priorities for their own development. So those are all the reasons for being positive, if you like. And down here, I list them all social, technical, demand, finance, business, government, governance, which means I think it is possible to drive an optimistic, or draw an optimistic graph, me and my diagrams, where this carbon-fueled, what I would call degenerative growing, can be pulled down, can be diminished, because we can bring in a different type of growing if all of these shifts happen. So I'm not saying that we wouldn't be able to grow, but it's a different type of growth. And it's that kind of diagram that spurs me on. And I think it can be driven by this idea of co-creation between the end user and the planet, I guess, and the designer. And that's where I get quite excited about what I experience when I come to the AA and work with Mike and Elif and co on MTech, because I see some exciting work with the students there. This is my own students on the right-hand side. I do something a little similar at Imperial College, where I take civil engineers and make them think about the planet, make them think about the purpose of any development project much more deeply. But what I see at MTech, for instance, and what excites me is architects and some engineers who I think will become co-creators of the future, they're bringing in really outcomes based on evidence, based on building an empathy with a problem, if you like, and the people that are suffering that problem. And we come to some of the projects, recent projects here, where you have problems of desertification, and find technical solutions. Well, first find the evidence to understand the depth of the problem, and then find technologies and solutions that can build out of that problem, and then create an architecture that relates to that problem and relates to the people that are going to live in those circumstances. And another one, not so much deserts, but oceans, thinking about a major problem, often stimulated by climate change, but that doesn't really matter, that affects many, many people. And it's building off real evidence, finding out how to use technology to gather more and more evidence about what the problems are, and start to test out solutions. And out of those solutions, build ideas, and out of those ideas, build a kind of architecture for the future. And I think that way of thinking, which is pretty parallel with what I'm trying to do with my engineers, but I don't end up with such delightful imagery, I think is really an important thing for the future, creating this kind of thinking. And I still see empathy as a really important thing. I think we build empathy by looking at the evidence, looking at what is happening, understanding how it's happening for people. We use these tools, and those tools allow us to share thinking and processes with everybody, and that means we can co-create. And that with that, and with the alliances who we do this with, it means we can I think really move on. So I think this is a kind of destination, and I think I might use this image that I created for this talk, again, because I think there's a lot in it. And I think, of course, the destination is to turn an increasingly unhealthy planet into a healthier one. And I kind of think of this as a getting back, restoring or finding a new equilibrium, a kind of new shared vision of what that looks like, that equilibrium. And I mean social equilibrium, as well as climate equilibrium. And I kind of wonder to myself in idle moments, is there a new architecture that expresses that somehow? Is it somehow EngTech trying to get there, or where is that happening? And ultimately, it's really important that we kind of recognize this is a fundamental shift in a way of thinking, a way of collaborating, and out of it needs to come some very new thinking, both in engineering and in architecture. And really what we're trying to do is build a safe and just space for humanity, as Kate Raworth reminds us. So that's the third ring in that diagram. And that's what I wanted to say. So I hope it's made some sense. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. We'd like to now open the conversation. So if there are any questions, you can unmute yourselves one by one, and we can start a discussion.
Thank you. I hope someone would like to ask a question.
Can I start? Thank you, Mike, for a very inspirational lecture. And my own view is very similar to yours, that our best hope is for a new architecture, and that's a generation, would say a generation scale project that it is within the hands of our younger students. And we hope by the time they get to your young age and my more advanced age, that the world is a far better place. But it is, I think, the primary task of their generation. And I'm very encouraged by that you have put forward that one of the things we can work with is to develop our tools in a way which is much more collaborative than in the past. So I think that's a very recent change in software, which is largely been driven by the attitudes of people like Mike Cook, who professionally wanted to have these kind of collaborative tools where people could, from quite different perspectives, work on the same model or on the same project. So I'm wondering, Mike, if there's some small project you could talk about where, I don't know if you've had any kind of live collaborations in the COVID period, but perhaps in the previous period where people could simultaneously come from different engineering or architectural practices and physically develop and computationally develop the same model.
I'm probably not the right person to talk about all the computational linking up because I'm still got my sketchbook, but let me start where it's easy to start, which would be it took me a while to realize, if you like, what was happening, and I wish I'd realized what was happening earlier. But the looking back, I can see that one of the successes, one of the reasons I feel that some of the projects I've worked on have succeeded in being very original and authentically original, original with purpose, has been that we've been able to share ideas really, really co-creatively quickly, and that I've found that a meeting which ends up with a series of shared agreed diagrams means there's no going back. It's everybody's understood. They all go away with the same diagram, and that in itself is really, really powerful. When it comes, and that's just, and I think that's about openness. I think a really important part of that is about not caring that it's your idea and their idea get kind of muddled and merged, and it becomes our idea, losing the possessiveness about ideas. And I do worry that we don't teach it that way. I think we teach architecture about possessing your own ideas and patting people on the back for having them and guarding them and copyrighting them. It's probably a bit like that with engineers as well, because, well, you're the scientist, you understand how science works, that's your idea. And I think throwing away ownership is hard, but for some people anyway, but necessary. But I think then when you come to sharing computers, I think the move towards open source sharing of capability is really critical, and losing that ownership problem. And when we own we all own a solution, the journey to it we all own, where you're not trying to mark who's made what contribution to it. And I guess that works too with shared computer models. My just finally, my real experience of sharing computer models is, and recently, say, with at the Barbican and with the development work on the new concert hall, which sadly looks like it might not happen in the centre of London, but by little bits of decent modelling of how people would experience the new building, it did more than just open up people's understanding of a possible new building. It started to open up a real conversation across all the silos of ownership of the what's the right way of saying, of the company. The facilities people, the dining and wining and dining people, the concert people, the rehearsal room people, actually had something to talk about that they could all share. They suddenly have this almost shared vision and shared understanding, which opened the dialogue. So the big thing is about how do you open dialogue between disparate people who normally live in silos, and that's kind of key, I think. And then stop owning a piece of territory and just own the end product. There we are. It's a long answer. And the Barbican, working with the Barbican has been a great fun, because as you know, also working on their old existing building, we all love the fact that it's an unintelligible building. So how do you work out what to do with that? It's fascinating.
I have a question, if you don't mind. It's a very interesting presentation. I want to know and find out your perspective towards the idea of co-creation. Does it mean that the disciplines are getting more mixed and the boundaries are blurred out? Or does it mean that there's a need for establishing a common language of communication? Because if you look at the same project from the engineering perspective and comparing to the architecture perspective, there are always some miscommunication and different terminologies, different understanding of different subjects. Do you mean by co-creation that these disciplines and boundaries are going to be blurred out and maybe another new discipline will be emerged, which some parts of the discipline and in practice, I see that is happening, or there's a need to establishing a better common language based on which we can actually communicate?
In a way, I think it's the latter in simple terms, and I'm not sure I always thought that, but I actually was forced to think about it more. A few years ago, I was asked to go over and see the people at Aalto University, Alvar Aalto, in Finland, in Helsinki, and they were worried because their joint school of architecture and engineering was about to be pulled apart and have separate architecture and engineering, and they kind of wanted me to come and empathize with them, I think, and talk it through and see if there was a solution. And I ended up thinking, you know what, I actually think there's a lot of strength in that separateness. The important thing is that you maintain an umbilical connectedness as well, because I think there is real need for different attitudes. There's value in different perspectives, but the important thing is then to really value the added value of coming together, and therefore this is all about it's partly about the tools that you can use now to help that coming together. You don't need to hide behind, complicated language, either engineers' language of bending moments or architects' language of, oh golly, what can I say? But you do use very complicated words some of the time, didactics and that sort of word. And you don't have to hide behind that because you've all got this kind of shared model, or whatever it is, a shared sketch, a shared model, a shared computer model, and you're already experiencing the same thing. So I think there's plenty of room for different perspectives, and we should encourage those. I think the point is we shouldn't just have these conversations between architects and engineers. We should be bringing in the sociologists, we should bring in the owners, we should be bringing in the community dwellers who are going to be involved in this, and we can bring them all around this piece of co-creation, and not, they're always going to be coming with different perspectives, but we need to create these tools, and sometimes it's games. I've seen really simple games that you can bring people together to play, where I see what you mean. If I want to do that and do that, I can't do it. It falls into a hole. So I'm going to have to make a decision. No, okay, and you start to kind of empathize with the problem and share each other's thing. So I think the common language is that is in the middle there of this, and it's almost the common, the way of understanding, the bigger picture, I suppose, is what we need. So I'm not against at all having those different professions, if you like. I am against the fact that we live in these silos and very independent institutions and so on, and don't really have sufficient desire to reach that level of co-creation and empathy. But I hope the urgency of the need will help change that.
Eliv, could I ask a question?
Yes, please. That's Brian Lilly, yeah?
Yes. Mike, thanks very much for a very stimulating set of slides and your talk. I share a lot of your similar concerns, I think. I come out of Michael's generation at the AA, so a bit gray around the beard for sure. The question I wanted to ask was really about scale and cross-scale learning, if you like. And I was very fortunate when I was at the AA to work with an engineer named Tim McFarlane.
Oh, yeah.
He'd done a lot with structural glass, and it was very inspiring to uncover that scale of material that engineers know, quite intimately, I think. And in a way, though, it seems like with your diagramming skills, you've been able to reach out or connect with different scales, both socially and materially. And I just thought it'd be interesting to think or to hear what you think about material now and its relationship to your diagrams, material relating to empathy, or how and why or where do you start to bring materiality into your conversation?
You're starting to get a bit architecturally on me now. Materiality, okay. Oh golly, I mean, when you think about the project I showed with Michael Hopkins, that was all about material and how to express material, and I had to do some better understanding of the good and bad and the ugly of castings and things like that. Gosh, I suppose at the moment my head is much more excited about bigger pictures of doing the right project, for the right people, for the right reason, and changing across a bigger scale. Materials are a big issue. I mean, I can't get past the fact that we need to use a lot less. Because there is no magic bullet material that we can use endlessly, even timber, which we really need to carry on doing its sequestering role uninhibited in the forests. So it's not a magic bullet by any means. So materiality, I think my real passion is in whatever the material you use. If you use it appropriately to its nature, and you use it, respectfully, it will look right. It will be the right choice. So what I think I don't like is seeing materials, if we're talking about construction, used in a kind of a way that doesn't respect their nature, and I don't know quite what that means in terms of translating terms, but I've always I think you can sense when a material the right material is being used, and for me as a structural engineer, it's probably partly to do with using tension. If you've got tension, then you use a material that really works in tension. If you've got compression, you use a material that really says, I deal with compression, and it's very simple stuff, really. But I probably don't get engaged deeply into that side of things at the moment mentally.
No, it's just kudos to Buro Happold, because we've worked with engineers that really proved our initial concepts about bending wood and working with First Nations communities here. And, Buro Happold was right there for us. And so, this is like a belated thanks in a way.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But then I would argue, I'm not a great, as I just said, I think the Hook Park, of course, AA knows and loves, hopefully. I love the using, making the timber shells, if you like, by simply bending the timber as a series of cantilevers into an arch. That's beautiful use of the material. I'm not so sure about a bit of high technology and slicing it into bits and gluing it back together in order to make a complicated shape says I am a piece of wood out of the forest in quite the same way. And I might find that more irksome when I see wavy, unnecessarily tortuous pieces of timber using a lot of technology and glue. Right.
Can I jump in with a question there? I think it carries on perhaps nicely. Hi, Mike and Michael. I'm an ex-student of Mike Weinstock's and an architect running a practice called Arboreal. Oh. And yeah, with my question is about...
There's a clue in that name, I imagine.
There is a clue. There's a clue or two. Yeah, you were kind of heading towards my question which is about form and biomorphism, of which you showed a number of interesting biomorphically inspired buildings. And so I'm curious about where you see the connections, where you see the value, and in biomorphism in relationship to how buildings and structures are addressing climate and ecological breakdown.
Now, can you define the architectural term biomorphism, please, in the spirit of collaboration?
Yeah, I suppose at its simplest, just the structures that look like natural forms, and of which you started off with many with FREng, and you were obviously enthusiastic, and I'm sure many of us are too, about these soap bubble-like, skin-like, cell-like structures. Are they? Yeah. Does that clarify it? So what's the connection for you between biomorphism and environmentalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think natural biomorphism I love, unnatural biomorphism I hate. Forcing something to look like it's natural isn't good. Actually allowing something to be where it wants to be naturally, I like. So I think it can be over-egged if we're not careful. I think there's a simplicity in nature that I would rather enjoy, I think, in a building than complexity. I don't know, if I took an example, I didn't dwell on it, but the project with Foster and Partners for the Smithsonian in Washington, we had long discussions about, and I was passionate about getting the right way of the column, which was a necessity for client reasons, and the inability of the surrounding building to support anything because it had no foundations. The column, how it spoke to the roof, and how it expressed itself, how the forces were going to go into the roof. And I was really keen that it was done incredibly subtly, and we ended up with something I'm really pleased with, which was, sorry, this is a kind of small detail really, but which is where the roof grid, which is a steel two-way grid, just simply gets meatier. The members get a little bit deeper, they get a little bit wider, and they acknowledge the fact that they're coming to a stress build-up point, but they don't make a big song and dance about it. You don't get one of these columns with multiple arms looking like trees and a load of noise. It's not a tree, it's a column. But there's a beautiful sort of, just as I feel in nature, the skin would grow thickness when it meets that point of contact. And we do that. And I think it's so subtle that probably 99.9% of people don't really notice it happening. And that's one of the joys. I think the British Museum, although really kind of hard work and complicated geometrically, to a point where I was quite scared of going in that direction. But it does everything so subtly. There's a subtle thickening and deepening as it goes towards the edge of the roof, because that's where the glass panes are bigger, and so there's more space between the elements. So it's natural to allow them to get bigger, and they needed to for stress reasons. And then towards the middle, they get smaller, and there's a lot of subtlety going on up there, but you don't notice it. I mean, the success of that project really is that it's almost so natural that nobody ever questions anything about it. It's just there. Somebody made a net and threw it over the roof. Actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And I like that sort of, much less labored response.
I think that partially answers the question, and certainly answers it very clearly in relation to structural efficiency. But it was more about how buildings tackle environmental issues and ecological breakdown that I was aiming towards. If you have anything more to say on that.
Well, how does what you're talking about solve those issues? You tell me what you think. Because I don't think it does, just like that.
Oh, certainly not just like that. I suppose the answers that I have, and the reason I asked you obviously is because I'm looking for better ones, but I think that there is an empathic element to it, that when we see a structure, we come into a structure that reminds us of natural places, natural organisms, that it may be beautiful. And for me, beauty is a kind of empathy. And it therefore reminds us that we are perhaps part of a biological world more than a machine world. We are not necessarily inhabiting machines for living, we are inhabiting other biologies, and I hope that the organism is becoming the primary conceptual model for buildings and no longer the machine. Maybe we're somewhere in the middle at the moment.
I think you're helping me formulate my own thoughts on this, and I'd say the danger for me is, unfortunately and sadly, and this is where, what on earth does a new architecture mean? As I say, there are no magic bullet materials, so the real solution to our problems are likely to be about finding ways of living, certainly in the overdeveloped world, if I can call it that, living with less but more purposeful development and reusing what we've already got in terms of building stock. The new development will be happening in places which lack those sorts of resources, to have the the luxury of reusing them. So I have a feeling the solutions that we're going to need to be developing, that will come out of those layers of changes that could happen, will be simple. And ultimately it'll be the simplest solutions using the least material. Now, that may mean some elegance creeps in if it turns out that to minimize material use in a flat slab, it has to have a wavy form, and we have to really tune it with modern methods of construction that tune every single beam to its appropriate depth and width and so on. If that's the way of minimizing our resources use, some elegance may creep in. But I have to admit, the honest truth is that most of our buildings need vertical walls and flat floors. So a lot of the fun that I've had with FREng and beautiful roofs only addresses 1% of the building market, if that. So your ordinary home and your ordinary office, if we build more, is just going to have to use as little material as possible, and preferably use material that's already been used, obviously. So I don't know that we have the luxury of biomorphic architecture in that respect. And that maybe is a debate we could have had with FREng, were he still here.
That would have been nice.
But I built everything on the dream that what FREng was doing was minimal use of materials. It happened to give us very elegant, beautiful forms. But to be honest, they were just the skins of buildings. They weren't much use for people. I did one project with FREng, obviously not on my own, but as a youngster, which was for Berlin, I think, a building exhibition, where he wanted everyone to have the freedom to build their own homes on a multi-story building. And that multi-story building was a pretty ordinary flat slab multi-story building that looked much like a car park. But the concept was that gave them land in a densely built city, not that dense, Berlin, but where they could then go and have a chunk of the slab and build their own concoction out of timber and used boxes and stainless steel, whatever it was. And that was probably the nearest I got to doing a normal building with FREng.
Mike, I have to say that building you just mentioned by FREng, there was a review of it in the New York Times about a month ago. And it's become, I think, one of the most well-loved buildings in central Berlin.
I don't know whether the one you're talking about is the one I worked on.
Okay.
Because I never took it past early concepts, but it may have gone. I just drew some slabs with some post-tension cables in them. It was the first time I'd done post-tensioning. And I think one of the reasons for putting post-tensioning was we've got some nice, beautiful curves in the drawings.
Yeah.
Of the flat slab. But I didn't actually know something had been built.
Yeah, but it's sort of it attests to FREng's flexibility in thinking, I think, as well, and his ability to work in a social dimension.
Yeah.
I was actually quite astounded when I found out that he was the architect engineer for the project.
Right. Yes. Yes. It was very different. Usually, of course, Frey worked in collaboration with another architect, didn't he? You know, that often he was brought into a project for that level of expertise he could bring, and it was almost always a co-created project. Yeah.
Excellent.
Just to, sorry, Mike, you wanted to say something, or shall I just continue?
Me? No, I'm always.
Okay. So I wanted to follow up on the educational part of your talk, and you touched on it earlier on as well. You talked about new models of education and having basically asking students of engineering to have more responsibility towards nature and environment. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are if you think there's room for improvement for students of architecture, perhaps starting from the undergrad stage. Do you think there should be more perhaps direct interaction between students of architecture and engineering? Like what could generate better communication and co-creation for students?
That's a very big question, which needs needs us to meet somewhere and with a bottle on the table. But so I can't answer it as I would like to. But yes, I would love there to be more. And I've touched on this, and I've never achieved it. You know, for instance, my Imperial students and once I've given them 2 years of how I want them to think, they've had to play at being architect, planner, engineer and everything, for them to sit with some real live architects, but who perhaps through a kind of MTech type upbringing value evidence, value, you know, getting the data, value actually understanding what the forces are at work, and then coming together. I think it's important that they've been trained how to think in a way which will allow them to then collaborate really well. I would love to see more of that. Not necessarily the merging of schools, but yes, the coming together of courses in the fourth year sort of idea would be very interesting, because I think I find it quite hard now to want to see, you know, far right, if you can call it that, engineering teaching, which is dull as ditch water, like I got when I was, you know, however many years ago in the 70s. You know, how dull can you make engineering? Well, they succeeded. I nearly had to change and become an architect, but somebody's told me not to do that. There were no jobs. Well, that's another story. You know, the far right, I'm not that interested in, and I'm not that interested in the far left of architecture, if you like, where everyone goes off, if there is such a thing, let's say, to be tactful, where everyone, you know, goes off and praises themselves and forgets the fact that they're there really to help society and communities. Maybe those two extremes are dying out, but we do need a new way. I know more about it in engineering, where engineers are not brought in and confined into some comfortable little hole which suits the teachers because they've got better things to do called research, and they don't come out excited and inspired about what their career could bring them, and don't have the skills of collaboration and co-creation. You know, they don't have the inspiration because they don't realize what a big role they can play in you know, reshaping people's lives. And there's more of that being talked about in engineering education, and I'm proud to say that the Joint Board of Moderators, which, you know, if you like, adjudicates over engineering degrees, civil engineering degrees, and such like, has come up with some very, you know, strong plans for change in what a good course looks like, and as that builds up, I think we will get much more broad-minded thinking. I'd like to see that happen in other institutions, professional bodies. I would imagine in the architectural profession, it wouldn't take such a shift, because there's always that social value, community creation side to architecture. What I find interesting in the MTech world, and I'm sure others are doing it, but bringing in the technical tools to build this understanding of the power of thought, and to a large degree, not having to worry about it as architecture, but of worrying it about as problem solving and community problem solving, I really like. And that's where we could definitely come together. And just as I was touching on that, I'd say that the thing I'm beginning to realize, and it was very last minute in my triangle diagram, empathy, that I think that's what I'm doing with my students at Imperial, and I think it's what you're doing with your students at the AA, is through looking at these problems, through identifying the problems, finding out how one can resolve those problems, you're building an empathy with the problem, an empathy with the people that are experiencing that. And I have a feeling that's right at the heart of this, which is why it's in the middle of my pyramid.
Yeah. Minad, you mentioned there are a few questions from the audience. Do you want to?
Yes, I mean, there was a similar question from the audience about the trajectory of someone who is about to start in the discipline, architecture or engineering. And what would you, as someone who has like an extensive experience in the field, what would you be your advice sort of to in what direction they should go and take? This was a question from
without meeting them, it would be wrong to say there's an answer, wouldn't it? I'd really need to understand the person, where they are, what they believe in, and then I could say, well, but what are the answers? One of the things I find most satisfactory in the way that we're currently educating is, I'm afraid, you're going to have to do both architecture and engineering. If you're looking for that bridging position, you could go to a joint school like Bath and places, Leeds and so on, that do joint courses. I don't know whether that's the answer, though. I have a feeling there's always a danger. There's always a danger that instead of having white and black, you end up with a grey, and the white and the black are quite bold and strong. So yeah, no, you need to know the person. If you could ask me, I don't know what my answer is. You could ask me, do I regret not having changed from engineering to architecture? And I think I'd say no. I don't regret that. I think I am an engineer, more an engineer than I could ever be in architecture, because I need evidence-based. I need evidence to be able to make any decisions. I think that, but actually that's not true as well. I now realize I've said it. It's not true. My first and foremost thing I know now in my designing is, what do I want to be true? What do I want to see? What matters enough to me to want me to then go away and probably find some other clever expert who can make it true. So I do feel there's room in both architecture and engineers to have a certain vision of what they want and what they believe is the right answer. And then with that, to go away and make it happen. And I use the term agenda a lot when I talk to people about that you have to have especially as engineers who are not trained in this way. They're trained often as pacifists in the argument. You tell me where you want it, Gov, and I'll put it there and I'll tell you how big it is. If you're going to be an activist rather than passive, you've got to have I think it should be, I want it to be, now I will prove to you that it can be made to work. And that's how you sort of stretch the boundaries. And you managed to do what Ian Liddell, one of my my mentors in my years at Buro Happold, always said, no, I have to put swear words in because he would always, the quote has swear words in it, but I've never bloody done what I've ever bloody done before. I heard, he would never do twice something that he's already done, and never had any time for anybody who wanted to just do something because it was safe and they'd done it before. So yeah, that's my safe answer. I'm staying on the fence.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
Not seeing any hands, but I'm not sure if hands go up on the screen.
Well, I'm not sure if everyone can raise hands. So if you can't raise your hand, you can unmute yourself if there are any questions.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I know, we've been speaking for quite a long time. I've got some students who will be waiting for me fairly soon. Carry on doing more of this tricky being put on the spot. And having to, especially with a whole bunch of predominantly architecturally trained individuals in this respect. I hope I haven't trodden on any toes.
Well, then let's all thank Mike for joining us for this really inspiring lecture. And thank you everyone for being with us. And lastly, you can find a recording of this lecture later on in our AA YouTube channel. So thank you everyone, and bye.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you. Bye-bye.